Well, thank you very much for being with me today. We'll be talking a little bit about your excellent film, The Chinese Exclusion Act. The questions will range from the big to the very small, so please feel free to let me know if you want to talk about anything else while we're having our conversation. But I guess maybe on a broad level, I was wondering if you could discuss the genesis of the project, how this film came to be from the idea to what we see now today.
I mean, it was really an idea as a film brought to us by the New York Historical Society, which is a wonderful historical society in New York, who conceived in 2012 of doing an exhibit about the Chinese Exclusion Act and assembled a really remarkable group of historians, including our colleague Renqiu Yu. And Li-Shin and I just jumped at the opportunity to do the film without, frankly, knowing an enormous amount about the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is kind of one of the big stories of the Chinese Exclusion Act, that it's part of the forgotten sort of legacy of America as opposed to something that's kind of cherished and put forward. And so we sort of joined forces with this extraordinary crew of historians and the New York Historical Society and moved into it over a 5-year period. And it was really, it had a genesis before that, in the sense that Li-Shin and I had come across, kind of examples of the sort of the purging and the violence in the West during the 1880s, and been struck by that because it sort of comes out of nowhere. It's not part of, the idea of Chinatowns in American Western cities and towns is not foreign to sort of the American kind of cultural reference. But the idea that there were sort of mass purges, that 34 mutilated, dismembered miners might be floating down the Snake River one spring in 1887, you sort of, more than said, what's with that? And I think it was with that, haunted by that image in our minds, that when we were approached, it really seemed kind of inevitable to take on this topic, which turns out to be one of those topics in American history which everything is in it. It's really the whole of American experience is really wrapped up in this story, one way or the other.
What did you find, Li-Shin? Rick mentioned the shock of the story. Could you further elaborate what you found resonated?
Yeah, I think at the time, not only was it the shock of the violence perpetrated against the Chinese, but the fact that it was not an isolated incident, that it was happening across the West. And then the fact that, how come I don't really know this history well enough? And so we started out thinking that we would want to do a story about that particular incident. But, then other films came to the fore, and this just kind of percolated in the background. So when the New York Historical Society came to us saying if we would want to do a documentary, it just, as Rick was saying, we jumped on the opportunity and then began to seriously discovering the incredible research work with historians like Renqiu and others in our film have done in the intervening 20-some years. New scholarship, new findings, meticulous digging through archives to extract the different strands of this story. So for us, it turned out to be, the timing is perfect.
Right.
I also want to say something. I've sort of felt this without being able to articulate it before sitting with you today, Fareed, which is that, there's an incredible line in Roman Polanski's movie, Chinatown.
Yes.
It's the last line. Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. And there's a way in which the idea of Chinese history is the impossible history. It's the history of no history. That's why you can forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. It's going to disappear into a kind of hazy, dark oblivion. Maybe they're smoking opium behind there.
Right.
But they're not us, and you're allowed to let it just sink like the Titanic down to the bottom.
Right.
And I think there was a really uncanny sense that we had when Rand and others kind of approached us with this history that, what do you mean forget it, Jake? It's Chinatown.
Right.
How has that come to be almost a sort of the shibboleth for a whole continent of forgotten and sunken American experience?
No, I think for me, sort of seeing this film in a constellation of other stories, not only about the Exclusion Act, but even about the West. You said this was this central massacre that sort of lit your imaginations with this haunted image of the West saturated by the blood of Chinese immigrants. And it reminds me that an unknown Western, but it's called a bomb. A bomb of a Western is Camino's Heaven's Gate, and which is about the violence that European immigrants felt in the West. And so I thought your film was an interesting addition to this kind of discourse about how we imagine the American West, not as a place of cowboys and Indians or Native Americans coming together and clashing, but rather these different immigrant experiences and learning who's in America and who's outside of America seems to stem in large part from this story of the act.
I think that's really right. That there's just an enormous amount about the American West, arguably more than any other region in America, which gets carried under and sort of disguised and hidden by the power of the myths and the reductiveness of the myths, so that we don't. It's almost like America's unknown land, even as it's one of the most popular places to have television shows and movies and Western novels and things like that. I mean, I think that's much less so in the last generation or two, but it's very striking that the power of those myths has been more obscuring than revealing, as with all myths.
Well, I mean, it seems for me, as a student of cinema, who's often approaching America through its myths and sort of seeing glimpses of something that's been pushed aside. We forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. Seeing these elements of a lost American voice within these stories. I'm curious, in your response to the filmmakers' views of this history of the Chinese Exclusion Act as representative of a forgotten Chinese American history. What's your response to that?
Well, they are very good historians. They have this perceptive understanding of the importance of this subject. As you too articulated that the Chinese Americans themselves were totally neglected and ignored in the discourse about them. In the mainstream narrative, there's virtually no their voice. And that's how we found it's so unfair as historians. So we went through all those primary sources, we did all those research, and we found that actually Chinese Americans are very active. And from the very beginning, they made their voices, but those voices were ignored. So we, through many years of research, we found those documentary evidence. For example, the story of Wong Chin Foo, documented in the film, that was rediscovered, his story. He was forgotten, but he was really a hero of a Chinese American. That's got rediscovered, and then that's very well presented in the film there.
Can you remind us again what Wong Chin Foo's story was?
Yeah, Wong Chin Foo was a Chinese who was brought to this country by a missionary and who studied in a college in Pennsylvania, got his degree, returned to China and became a reformer in China. And the Qing government put a price on his head. So he returned to this country and he got his American citizenship before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. So he was a very, very active pioneer in the civil rights movement. He showed his understanding of the founding principle of this country, and he defends the Chinese civil rights. He gave speeches. He gave lectures in the East Coast. And before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, he actually traveled a lot to different cities, making speeches against it. And after that, he actually organized the Chinese civil rights organization called Chinese Equal Rights League to protect the rights of the Chinese Americans. I believe he was the first Chinese to ever testify in Congress, and he is the one who coined the term Chinese American.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. And to me, it really frames that a core theme of this film seems to be, it's not only a story of oppression, but it's a story of resistance. You know?
Oh, tremendously.
And I think
And a
seeing,
story of law and legislation.
yes. And for me, I mean, as someone who's very curious about how the law perks up within these mythic texts, you know, what a Western might say about slavery or immigration law, what a superhero film might say about wartime law, the war on terror. I'm very curious to all of you, how do you think the cinema as a form is particularly well suited to articulate the consequences and maybe the human stakes of the law?
You know, that's an incredibly important question, and I think it's answered in many different ways by many different kinds of films. I mean, to some degree, to the degree that law in media and cinema is reduced to courtroom drama, in a sense, it misses almost the entirety of the law. And it usually turns out to be pitting sort of character against character, you know, in a kind of an agonistic situation where there's a clear winner and a clear loser at stake. And I think that what's missed in those representations of law is the degree to which, you know, if someone famously once said that, you know, war is politics carried on by other means.
Right.
You know, law is an institutionalized form of violence. And it's the authority that is invested in law, the way the law shapes physically lives, the spaces people live in, when they can come, really tell you that what the law is really has less to do with what happens in the courtroom, though the outcomes are crucial, and more to do with the degree to which almost the entirety of our collective lives are adjudicated within a system that we call law. Who can come here, who can't come here, what happens when they are here, do they vote, do they not vote? You know, can they carry a pole on the streets of San Francisco? Can they operate a wooden laundry? So far outside the precincts of the courtroom, it seems to me what you want is fiction and nonfiction representations to make one understand that the shaping force of the law, one way or the other, is absolutely creating the space in which we live. And that, I think that is so fantastically illuminated in the case of the Chinese Exclusion Act, whose very title, you know, includes the forcefulness of, you know, shaping what spaces, literal and metaphorical, Chinese could live or even be in America, and what ways they could be. And I think that I would love to see a cinema that was much more devoted to the fact that what happens, you know, within, you know, the legal Eagle office is really the tip of an iceberg of social, political, cultural, demographic contestation, all of which is absolutely to do with the law, and really is where we all come together. And the law is the circumstance under which we come together or don't, unless we're somehow lawless, outside the pale, wandering, you know, beyond the fences of our civilizations in the wilderness. And since those places don't exist anymore and haven't for a long time, everybody lives within the bailiwicks of some aspect of law. And I can't really think of an American story that tells more about the most, it's almost a meta story of law and American space. Because it's really about the sovereignty of who gets to be in this space, who can't be in this space, what they can do when they're here. And I find that sort of extraordinarily fascinating, as well as having almost limitless dramatic potential.
Right. I mean, the fact that we see in this film that the law is not a concept of the courtrooms, but it manifests in the pain of Angel Island.
Right.
You know, a sort of a prison that even I went to school at Berkeley, and I was looking at May Nai's, who's cited in your film, work on immigration, and I went to a professor and I said, "Oh, you know, I was thinking about, you know, how after 9/11, the immigration situation. Immigration law is really against, perhaps, immigrants of a certain kind. And he laughed, the professor, and he looked at him and he goes, Fareed, are you saying this is a new phenomenon? And I was like, well, I'm reading a lot of, and I didn't say this, but some of her contemporaries were saying, well, 9/11 has changed everything. And he goes, you really want to know what changed everything? Fareed, if you're ever standing outside at any place in the Bay, turn your head to Angel Island. And I was like, ha. And I think your story is such a powerful reminder of the fraught history immigrants, the melting pot as a myth is something that I think your film challenges. And I guess maybe for you, Li-Shin, did you find there was particular challenges in terms of trying to visualize a story about the impact of the law?
Yeah. That's always, for a historical documentary, what do you visually see when you tell a story? And I think in this case, it's not that we start the film with the foot of the Statue of Liberty. That is our symbol of what the ideal American ideal is, is the Statue of Liberty, that we're welcoming immigrants. But, history shows us that that has not always been the case. We've always been ambivalent about it, as Erica Lee tells in the documentary. And so it's through time, how do we understand this past to inform ourselves for the future?
Well, I mean, you've picked up, I think, on one of my favorite images of the film, and one of my favorite visual motifs is the presence of the Statue of Liberty.
Right.
And you seem to open up on this powerful image of a literally fragmented liberty. Oh! And I remember as we watched it, the stakes of this story, though it was, I think, boldly asserted with that image, it made me ask, what is this film's relationship to the Statue of Liberty and to we've used the phrase myth throughout.
The funny thing is when myths and icons are fully formed and in place, literally or metaphorically, we do this funny retroactive, imaginative force on them and say they've always been there. So once the statue is up, once the Empire State Building is up, once any monument is up, suddenly the meaning of being a monument is that they were always there. And, we may make movies about them actually being built, but nevertheless, they somehow they're taking the form that they were meant to always be in anyway, so even if they technically weren't always there, they were always there. But of course, that's not the case. And, I can't think of a more perfect metaphor for this whole story than something so simple and iconic out in its own harbor as the Statue of Liberty, going through this, process of its own long process of gestation and assembly, with this particular kicker in the case of the statue. The Chinese Americans were asked to help pay, solicited to help pay for the fund of the pedestal on which she would stand. So it turns out not only was she not always there, and she was a work in progress, and there's a whole sort of constructive drama that goes on with it. The fact is that Chinese Americans themselves were involved when she was not yet built, being asked, ironically, the most undignified question. Will you contribute to the erection of this monument to a liberty that you don't partake of?
And
so, at that point you want to say, right, the statue wasn't always there. When is the statue there? Is the statue there now, just because she's there? Maybe she was built really in 1960, when there was a sea change in American attitudes towards immigrants to some degree. And suddenly, in a generation which includes my own, one thought of the Statue of Liberty as being something that was always there and had always been a benevolent, welcoming image for, an ingatherer of people, of the American nation. So I think that it's funny, there's just a way in which the kind of both the deconsolidated and the consolidated statue, just to me speaks, I think to all of us, speak volumes about the complexities of the sort of the images and the identities that we kind of cling to and assume they've always been there, but maybe they weren't.
I think for me, watching how you interact with these still images, how your camera wanders to its tensions and its contradictions, it's part of the visual excitement of this film seems to be sometimes the shock, how we're in blackness for a moment, and then the camera pans and we see what is this? Some bright color, and we thought we were in a torrent, it seems, and then you pan and we see we were looking at an image of the Statue of Liberty under 4th of July fireworks,
Right.
it seems.
Yeah.
Ooh. And as a viewer, I think you're encouraging us this kind of your camera is in some ways like a metaphor for the work of the film, which is to take these symbols and to look at it obliquely, to see an oblique and lost history, to see the night in the celebration of the 4th of July, and to see the shadow that the Statue of Liberty leaves behind for a group of
I'm
marginalized.
so glad that resonates with you. I feel that that's really, very much, and not just with images of the Statue of Liberty, but very much part of the visual strategy of the film. To sort of defamiliarize you, and then you find the familiar, but within a new context, or maybe start familiar, but then as you tilt up Lady Liberty, there's a skull at her feet, and then she turns out to be this ghastly, demonic Chinese, Lady Liberty.
Right.
It's kind of a series of, kind of accusatory, sort of tags associated with her. So it somehow is a kind of, but instead of the beauty of the Lady Liberty at sunset, there's a kind of miasmic, sort of toxic quality to it. And that finding that, in the process of finding it, rather than just kind of presenting it, here's that caricature of the statue.
Right.
To get people to be kind of already leaning into it and making a set of assumptions which are rebuked by what the consequence. That I think that throughout the film, more than any of the films we've worked in, I think that strategy was very much fundamental to it.
I mean, it's a fairly shocking through line because you constantly. So another powerful visual moment is, as we discussed before we started taping, was the juxtaposition of the Golden Gate Bridge, which we've seen through the experience of Angel Island,
Right.
and you cut sharply against the Statue of Liberty, as though you're kind of reminding us to look to. You were describing kind of lady oppression,
Right.
the fractured mirror of Lady Liberty that the Chinese Exclusion Act forced us to see. So I think for me as a viewer, it's a powerful evocation of the limits of these myths. And you were talking, Rick, about defamiliarization, and I guess for the historian, you're the historian of film. Thank you, Bill. But for the historian, I would ask, what is the process you find in terms of the productive defamiliarization that cinema can bring to history? Do you think of it as a potent platform for historians to talk or to find a new audience for these kinds of stories?
Absolutely. If you check those anti-Chinese literature, they have a persistent tendency to blame the victim. If the Chinese are not allowed to come to this country, if the Chinese are denied the right to become naturalized citizen, it's all their fault because they are different, because they hold on to the traditional Chinese culture, because they cannot be assimilated into Chinese culture. Now, as historians, we dig out those documentary evidence to prove that that was false, that was not true. The Chinese are dignified people, and they understand and the founding principles of this country very well. They identify with that, and they have faith in that. And we have documentary evidence to prove that. Therefore, as historians, we are very thrilled to have these very gifted filmmakers to present that so well in the film, and while covering all the complexities of the issue there. So as historians, actually, we are very, very grateful. We have this great opportunity to cooperate with two masters in filmmaking.
I think, Ren, you're sort of framing that this is a powerful mode of presentation. That, you know, when we see these stories told through your eye and through your montage, we feel it viscerally. And so often I think the law and history, it can seem, you were talking about how you wanted to show that the Statue of Liberty could be in progress rather than something that's status quo and that exists. But I think for me, the exciting part of this film is to see that there is a history that was really alive, that had human stakes, and that its ripples continue forward into, you say early on in the film, or one of your subjects says, what it means to be American.
Right.
And so to see, I think for me as a student of film and always curious about how history is discussed within it and presented, as you put it, I think this is a very important reminder of how the form itself can allow us a kind of visceral immediacy, and here sometimes the victory, as when someone succeeds in their acts of resistance, as are detailed in the film, as well as the kind of often lost despair,
Right.
that we see. And I think for me, even thinking about where this film, to your point about presentation, this film had its Chinese premiere here at NYU Shanghai. And I was very curious, as an institution that is itself a kind of meta, resonant institution to what the Chinese Exclusion Act was describing, which is the U.S. and Sino relations, but in a very, hopefully very positive light. New York and Shanghai, the U.S. and China coming together in a kind of dialogue and celebration. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the significance of showing the film here.
I think you've described, for me, really exactly why it was very, very moving to be here and to kind of have this be one of the first places where it was showcased in part. Because, you know, the effort of the history that Ren and his colleagues have done is to, in some sense, you know, detach American history from the familiar, you know, structures and icons and reattach it to something which is more real, sheds more light on it, which in the case of Sino-American relations means, you know, it can't be, as you were saying earlier today, that Americans see Chinese as a footnote in American diplomatic history and vice versa. Because that's, both points of view are, you know, basically doing one of those Saul Steinberg cartoons in which the rest of the world is seen in a rapidly diminishing perspective, whereas the real world is the 4.5 acres immediately around you. And so I think the wonderful opportunity of the world we live in now is the degree to which, at least if not legally and politically, imaginatively and as human communities, we can choose to deconstruct, you know, those kind of shrinking horizons, expand our horizons, and then imagine, right, here we are in Shanghai, you know, so many hundreds of miles from South China, where those people, you know, 150 years ago and more, you know, got on American ships because they had heard that there was gold in the mountains and came over. And that phase of the story began, to feel it from within the dense context of Chinese experience, rather than simply as something like, well, among the people who came over for the American gold rush were these, you know, queue-wearing, you know, Chinese workers. So it's kind of, it's really, I find it very moving, because it just, the hope of the film is, I think, or the hope of the story, which the film tries to reflect, I think is the expansiveness of a different kind of way of imagining, you know, where your home is, where you're allowed to be at home. And I think it's moving to me to sort of look at you and your colleagues here at NYU Shanghai and think, you know, where do you start thinking of your home as being? You know, and it turns out that in the 21st century, it's possible to think of yourself as being really at home almost anywhere. It's to some degree. It's a luxury to have it be a state of mind, but if you have that luxury, it is a state of mind.
Well, thank you all so much for bringing this community-affirming piece of cinema, wonderful piece of cinema to NYU Shanghai, and for talking with me today. It's an absolute pleasure, and congratulations again on your film.
Thank you for
Thank you.
Wonderful to talk.
Thank you.